taken by foot.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. You got one of those.
I gotta ask David something.
I don't really care about that, so it's all about.
I did.
Okay.
Give it a lot.
Oh.
How come gravel is so expensive?
Saw your office, Jason, the other day. I stopped in and talked to Luke.
Oh, good. Yeah.
He's on our board now.
Yes, he was saying. That's good. That's a good pickup for your board.
Yeah, I think it'll be real good. Will be real good. I've got some functions in mind for him to take them away from your work, so, you know.
Well, we've been doing more and more basic commercialization.
That's what he said, yeah. Yeah, it's good.
So
Movie night? Huh? Movie night? Yeah, there is some admission, but only afterwards. I think it's worth it.
All right, let's see how it
There's
goes.
real accountability.
I see they're getting going over at Target, which is nice. I see a little bit of movement. Some people seem to be, there's a trailer and there's a dumpster outside, so that's progress.
I've been waiting for final vote from UDA. I haven't talked to Rob this week.
Yeah, I just saw there were trailers outside. I figured it was getting closer. All right, might as well get going. We know anybody, is Mr. Beckett coming? Is he,
He said he was, but I haven't heard anything else.
okay. All right, we'll get going. Welcome this evening to our planning board meeting. It's Wednesday, November 15th, 2017. First item on our agenda is a roll call. With us this evening, we have Jason Charlin, we've got Lisa Buck, we've got Krista Swincher, we've got Judd McIntosh, myself, Phil Ruck, we've got Dave Thompson, and Mike Costello down on the end. Next up is acceptance of the agenda.
Move for acceptance.
Second.
Very good, you're quick on the draw. Any changes, comments?
Yes.
All right. Just on the agenda first?
Not the agenda, I'm sorry.
All right, so we've got a motion. Any other edits on the agenda? Hearing none, all those in favor? Very good. Moving on, approval of the minutes.
That's right.
Krista, you'll be at minutes of September 20th, 2017. Can I get a motion for that?
I move we approve the minutes.
Very good. Second?
I'll second.
You're up, Krista.
Okay. On the second page, there are some numbered items, 1, 2, sort of in the middle of the page. And number 1 says all interior renovations must be permitted and certificates of approval must be issued prior to operation. Do we mean permitted or is that completed? What's that?
Permitted, like through the code enforcement office?
Okay, so they have to be permitted through the code enforcement's office. Okay. And then on page 3, just ahead of the all the numbers, Mr. Chubbuck moved to approve the application as submitted with the following, and it says recommendations. Are those conditions? Okay.
Page 2 toward the bottom, I noticed there is a blank there. Should that be filled in? Was that placeholder for something? It says section blank. Any others?
There's one on approval, on page 1 under 3, approval of minutes. Ms. Buck moved to approve, it says the minted.
Good old spell check.
Yep.
Any others? Very good. Thank you, folks. So we have a motion and a second. Guess we're approving the minutes as amended. All those in favor? Very good. Actually, I can't vote. I wasn't here. Take that back.
Well, you can vote.
If I wasn't at the meeting, I
I
can.
think technically you can vote.
Huh.
I thought
If you want, but if you want to
could
abstain, you can.
Yeah, I didn't remember.
You can vote if you reviewed all the, well, not for the minutes, but.
Just editorial comments, yeah. All right, leave me on then. I made a comment. Must have done something. Next up, we have one public hearing this evening. It is a review of an amendment to the following sections of the land use ordinance: 18-131, 18-136, 18-144, 18-166, 18-168, 18-177, 18-206, 18-208, 18-210, and the addition of section 18-112 to the land use ordinance to establish the vernal pools overlay district in a portion of the town's designated growth area as identified in the town's comprehensive plan, which is located generally east of I-95 north of Kelly Road, around exits 191 and 193 of I-95. And we are also having a general advisory discussion. So we,
Chairman,
yes.
I need to exchange my packet with my wife because she has mine and I have hers.
Ah,
Got mixed up on the dinner table, I guess.
That's,
Thank you.
very good. That being said, we did receive a nice packet, a lot of information. So could you please summarize what we're going to be listening to this evening?
Good evening, Planning Board. Jana Richards, Town Planner. I put together this PowerPoint presentation on the Vernal Pools Overlay District, which is what we're going to discuss tonight. You have in front of you an ordinance with some draft language that was put together actually by Evan. So I'm going to give a little background on vernal pools in general, just what they are, to give a bit of background information. Talk about the current regulations for vernal pools at both the federal and the state level, and then move on to talking about alternative vernal pool regulation that was put together through a long process that Evan was actually a part of, so I'll ask him again to come forward at that point to describe part of that process in creating what's known as the Special Area Management Plan for Vernal Pools, also known as the SAMP. And then we'll go into more details about the proposed amendments to the land use ordinance that would create the Vernal Pool Overlay District. And then really what we're here tonight, after learning about all of this, is to have a discussion and hear your questions and concerns for the overlay district, and hear from the public if anyone's here that would like to comment on it, and then we'd like to move the discussion forward to the next planning board meeting after that to make any actions. So there won't be any actions taken tonight. It's really just a learning experience on this vernal pool ordinance. So I'll go on to what is a vernal pool. So they are small, about less than 1/10 of an acre in size, and they occur naturally in shallow depressions throughout the landscape, especially here in Maine. One of the main characteristics is that they go dry, whether throughout the year or they could be dry every other year, or there would be wet and then 2 years later dry and then wet again. So they're very intermittent, and because they're intermittent like that, they are fishless. Fish can't move back and forth between the vernal pools, and they can't be sustained. And that's really important. Well, I want to show you some pictures of vernal pools first, so you just get a general idea. You know, if you go hiking or go for a walk in your backyard, you might stumble across some of these vernal pools from time to time.
Are these all local?
Yes, these were put together by the University of Maine. And here, this one's in particular is when it goes dry. It just really looks like a depression in the landscape, and it's not until you see some water in it that you really do recognize that it is a vernal pool. So it's important, like I said, that they're fishless, because you have these critters, these amphibians that go to the vernal pools specifically to breed, and the indicator species that are looked at within a vernal pool include the wood frog, the spotted salamander, the blue spotted salamander complex, and fairy shrimp. And like I said, they particularly go there and just a couple months out of the year, particularly in the spring, to breed and lay their eggs, and they have these incredible egg masses that can be seen throughout the vernal pools. Even though they're fishless, doesn't mean that the eggs are protected, because there are other species, small and large mammals and shorebirds and other birds that use the vernal pools as feeding locations. So they go there and they can feed on eggs, or they feed on other critters that are within the vernal pool area. So it's not only important for the amphibians who are going there to breed, but there's other species that rely on vernal pools in order to survive. So vernal pool habitat doesn't just include the vernal pool itself. The biologists have tagged a lot of these amphibians and seen that they can roam far from the vernal pool in the off season when they're not breeding. So in the winter and the summer months, they utilize the upland forested area surrounding the vernal pool, and you can see like the wood frog can go up to almost 1,500 feet away from the vernal pool itself. So when scientists look at this, they don't just look at the vernal pool and the surrounding area as part of the habitat. They look at the vernal pool and this unfragmented, large forested area where the species are able to roam, basically. So I'm going to talk about current vernal pool regulations that limit development, and that's important for planning board purposes. So the federal regulation that we look to is mandated by the Army Corps of Engineers. So really, in the event that a vernal pool is within a wetland, it can be classified as water of the United States. If that's the case, then the Army Corps of Engineers takes jurisdiction over the vernal pool and the surrounding wetland area through the Clean Water Act, and they limit development within 750 feet of the vernal pool. If it's a standalone vernal pool, it's not within a wetland complex, and the Army Corps isn't able to therefore take jurisdiction, the Maine Department of Environmental Protection would take jurisdiction, and they have a limit of 250 feet of development around the vernal pool. But it has to be what they classify as a significant vernal pool, and that is basically there's egg mass counts that are done, and there's other criteria that classify it as a significant vernal pool. So if it's a significant vernal pool, then the DEP comes in and will regulate on that vernal pool. But if it's not classified as significant, then there is no regulation, there's no limitations. So this is sort of an issue because, as you can see, the 750 feet and 250 feet limitation area doesn't really protect these species who roam, you know, some of them up to 922 feet away from the vernal pool. And so from a scientific standpoint, this level of regulation and these limitations really isn't protecting the species that it's supposed to protect.
It's also the federal definition of waters of the state is currently under review as well, so that may be subject to change.
That's true. You know, like I said, it has to either be a significant vernal pool or it has to be classified as a water of the United States, and many times the vernal pool isn't classified as either of those, and therefore there's no regulatory body that can limit.
But they're looking to peel back that definition of waters of the state on a federal level.
Oh, At the federal level, yes,
Correct,
yes,
yeah.
yeah. So that would affect it even further.
Mhm.
And this is just a fun little graphic showing that they go outside of that 250-foot buffer. Animals know no boundary. They just, you know, they're able to travel and they will go wherever they have to be able to disperse and colonize other pools, which sort of brings me to one of the other issues, you know, that the 250-foot and 750-foot limitations really just protects the pool and the surrounding area. And what that does is it creates isolation, and this photo shows it really quite well. You have a vernal pool, you have, you know, a cleared forested area around it. It was once a forested area. And then you have development just on the fringes. And what happens is this isolates the animals. They're not able to travel where they're supposed to, and this is particularly negatively impacts juveniles and the babies that are born here. What they do is they disperse and they're able to colonize new pools, and what that does is it ensures that there's no interbreeding at this pool. And if there is interbreeding at this pool, what biologists say is that the vitality of that pool over time will decline, and the pool itself will sort of die out. And, you know, so are you really, is it really a protection if over time they're not able to sustain and flourish and become successful? So aside from the scientific issues surrounding the current regulation, there's also some socioeconomic issues with the current regulation. What this map shows, so the comprehensive plan that was adopted in 2015 showed a designated growth area for the town of Orono and a designated rural area. And you also have this in your packet, so if you want to see it up close and personal. And what the green area is actually the designated development area, and it's a small difference between the designated development area and the designated growth area. It basically takes out some conserved land and land that wouldn't be developable. And really, this is where the town has a goal of developing in the future. It's close to amenities, it's close to schools, it's walkable to downtown, it's on utilities. You know, this is where the town has a goal of developing while keeping the rural area, the yellow on the map, in character with a rural. So they don't want development to occur out in those areas like they do within the density that they want to within the designated development area or the green. So the current regulation, you know, within the designated development area, there's smaller lot sizes, and any sort of limitations on development can make it almost impossible to develop within the green area, because it would hinder the lot size even further and restrict the amount of development that can occur within that area. Another socioeconomic issue with the current regulation is that it causes unpredictability for the developer. There is not currently a comprehensive map of vernal pools statewide that shows their level of significance. And so when a developer goes into a project, they're really taking a gamble whether or not there's going to be a vernal pool on the property or not once they've invested a certain amount of time and money within the into the property and the application going before the planning board. So as a result, some landowners and applicants and developers, because they're uncertain of when they're going to encounter a vernal pool, may avoid developing in an area where they think that there's a vernal pool. They may get midway through the process and have to spend extra money that they weren't thinking that they were going to have to before, or have to modify their proposal, or they might pull out altogether. And I want to call Evan up for this piece of it because he has some knowledge on what's going on in this map here and the next map after. Examples of when the current vernal pool regulation caused some issues in town.
Not a long point. This doesn't show up well, the arrow here on this, but you're all, I think, familiar with, can you see that?
I don't think they can.
I can't see it either. I'll scan it. You're all familiar with Spencer Street and Westwood. This is Main Street, and you see the field there that's by trees. That's Dr. Tozer's property. And just north of that is the property that was going to become a subdivision called Black Bear Heights. This is a better danger.
Is that near 101? Is that what you're talking about?
Well, the trouble is, it doesn't. I can, but it doesn't show up on that TV. So there used to be. Let me just see if there's a thing that pulls this thing down and be used as a pointer, but I don't see it.
Can we tell by the numbers?
Yeah,
Evan, just the general reference of, was it
Yeah.
100?
That's a good. I'm going to step away from this microphone, hopefully. If you see 101, that's on Dr. Tozer's property.
Yeah.
If you, the next one up, 100, is the vernal pool that was identified, evaluated, found to be significant on the development that was going to become Black Bear Heights. Black Bear Heights was going to be a cluster single-family housing development proposed with, I think, around 2004, 2003, 2004. The plan there was that you can see, if you see the road, the local road, the cul-de-sac just above the 100, that road doesn't actually exist. That was the approved subdivision road, and the lots either side of it were part of the approved lots. The vernal pool itself is in a kind of a polygon, which was actually going to be conserved land under the cluster development. The idea, the proposal, was to extend that road across a narrow part of the wetland. That vernal pool is embedded in an extended wetland that goes from the Tozer property all the way up to behind the school property. You see the kind of darkness in the red. The darker red is wetter land. And the idea was to find a narrow spot in that wetland to cross it. And develop the back part with another 26 lots or so. That's how the developer was going to make it work. The Army Corps took a look at that vernal pool and said you can't be within 750 feet of it. And so that knocked out the second half of the development. And that, in combination with litigation by neighbors and ultimately the recession that hit in 2008, deep sixth the development. He abandoned that development, and the land went back to the original owner. The conservation land went away. The town had to give up the lot that was going to be conserved for conservation. And so now it is vacant land. The town, in general, supported this as a matter of policy because it's so close to services, walking distance to the schools, buses, downtown, and was an efficient way to use the land and still have some conservation. It was going to be 52 homes was the original proposal. What got approved was 26. And this planning board approved that development, including the second phase, which was going to be on the other side, but the Army Corps would not. And this was part of the impetus. This project was part of the impetus of the University of Maine folks around Calhoun to both pre-identify as many vernal pools as you could and determine their significance, but also to go a little farther than that, because she understood, as we understood, and as our town comprehensive plan even back then understood, and certainly now understands,
that if all you do is protect the vernal pool here and push development out, you're probably not doing an awful lot for the environment. You're pushing it out into other open landscape, causing people to drive farther, fragmenting other landscape areas that are also important to other forms of wildlife. So you're kind of moving the environmental issue from one medium to another while compromising the overall thrust of the State Zone Growth Management Act, which is to try to guide development as best as possible into compact areas close to services and amenities. So that was one of the impetus behind Aram, Dr. Calhoun, really wanting to move ahead to find a different way to think about vernal pools and vernal pool regulation.
And that sets us up nicely for talking about the alternate vernal pool regulation, or the SAMP. Really, you know, given all the issues that Evan just said and that we went through before, there was sort of a common ground between scientists like Dr. Calhoun, developers, the town, and municipalities to find an alternative for this, for the issues that were caused by the current regulation for vernal pools. You know, it was found not to be the best case scenario, and they wanted to find an alternative. And the alternative would help allow for growth in the designated development area. It would provide more landscape scale conservation for the vernal pools and in the rural area. And it would provide more predictability for developers going forward, developing within the designated development area. And what you see here is a graphic showing a vernal pool crossing lots within the designated development area. You know, smaller lots, the vernal pool crosses both. They would have to go, I think this one probably shows about 750 feet buffer, which would almost make larger scale development impossible within that area. And what the alternative is proposing is that you would be able to compromise that vernal pool within the designated development area as long as you, the developer, meaning not you, the developer went forward and conserved at a landscape scale vernal pools in the rural area. And we're going to talk more about what the landscape scale means. It's so for every one vernal pool that's compromised within the designated development area, the developer would have to put forth funds to be able to conserve 2 vernal pools and 70 acres within the rural area. And the vernal pools are included in that 70 acres, and that's per pool that's compromised within the designated development area. So it's sort of like a transfer of development rights. You're able to do something and you know, go forward with development in the designated development area where the town wants development to happen, and as long as you pay a fee to be able to conserve at a landscape scale, which is what the biologists are saying really is intended to protect these species in the rural area. Again, I'm going to call on Evan because the development of the SAMP really took, I think he said, about a 6-year process, and there was a lot of stakeholders involved, and Evan was involved in it, so I'm going to let him describe to you the process.
Yeah, so were Dave and Pat involved all along, and Shep Shepard from the Orono Economic Development Corporation was involved. Jeff Gordon from the council at the time was involved in all of these sessions. So just the Reader's Digest version of the background is that Dr. Calhoun, renowned wetland biologist who has a particular specialty in vernal pools and small-scale ecological systems, had a great interest in figuring out, because she does not have confidence, she and the other biologists at both in the regulatory agencies and in the research world don't have confidence that the 250-foot rule or even the 750-foot rule will actually serve to sustain the vernal pools where they become isolated. So, for example, at the avenue, which there are 4 vernal pools that were identified there, at least one of which, maybe 2 of which were significant under the Natural Resource Protection Act. At least 2, if not 3 of those are entirely isolated now, or, with that 250-foot thing, because the developer was able to and did go right up to the edge of that circumference. I think there's one that, through our clustering provisions, has a larger open space area that may give that vernal pool a fighting chance. Yeah.
Has there been any evaluation of those isolated vernal pools? Because when I was reading the packet, I thought of those, and I wondered if
there would be over time. One of the, as you might recall, one of the conditions that this planning board put on the developer in the easement language that was between the developer and the Orno Land Trust is that the vernal pools could be used for research purposes. And so it can be monitored by the scientists. Dr. Calhoun and her research team have been doing all kinds of research on the genetics. They've tagged these critters in multiple pools. That's how they know how far they go and what vectors they follow and what kind of upland habitat they're looking for their year-round protection and feeding and
so that picture that you showed before looked like the avenue, and that's recent tracking data?
Yes, it's all within the last 2 years. They've been working with, the last 2 or 3 years. And that particular photo was the Pierce Pond, the Pierce vernal pool. Some of you might have recognized it. It's off of Forest Avenue, and where Noyes Street and Mountain View and that area up behind there, and that in turn connects to the pool that's on the Rampy conservation easement that the Orno Land Trust owns behind the Rampy home at the end of one of those subdivision streets. So that's very recent, and they have data throughout multiple locations in this region and in other parts of the state.
Did you say they've been tracking the avenue, those pools?
I don't know if they've been tracking that yet. I know one of the graduate students asked permission to do so, and I noted the terms of the easement that they had permission to do that. So I think they did some research there. Whether they tagged animals there and tracked them, I don't know. But we do have some baseline data from some survey work that was done for the development, and so it could be tracked 5 years from now or 10 years from now. In this system, the solution that the biologists were headed toward were, as Janice said, was how can we protect the vernal pool ecosystem at a larger scale. We might lose one here and here and here, but we can preserve things with certainty in the rural area where the town would prefer not to have a lot of growth, and preserve that at a landscape scale rather than have it divided into 2-acre subdivision kinds of situations. And to do that, there needed to be a legal mechanism for doing it, short of amending the laws, amending the Natural Resource Protection Act, or amending the Clean Water Act. Fortunately, there was such a tool that's been in place for quite some time under the Army Corps of Engineers, and that's called this Special Area Management Program. The Special Area Management Program is designed to customize the protection of wetland-related natural resources over large landscape areas in ways that might not be the one-size-fits-all of the normal regulation, but you go through a very fairly demanding analytical process of justifying why it's needed and what the alternatives are and the benefits that this would bring, and you have to have the biologic and other data to back it up. But that was available. And under that system, there are multiple players, and you don't have to read this chart, but the chart is representative, those colors are representative of the different players. This is just background. You don't really have to be burdened with this unless you're interested in it, except to the extent that it affects the town directly and the planning board directly. But essentially, the system is, are we going to describe this in more detail coming up? Okay. I'll just say there are players where the Army Corps of Engineers has the initial role of approving the plan, which it did formally after 6 months of notifications, public hearings, and outreach sessions. They did that in September, just a little over a year ago, September 2016. Topsom and Orono are seen as the two pilot towns, and they're one of the colors, and we have a series of things we as a town need to do to make ourselves eligible to participate in this alternative if we want to. We don't have to, but if we want to. And then the developer has a role, some obligations, and then there has to be a third-party conservation organization, which in Orono would be the Orono Land Trust, if they are able and willing, and initial conversations are that they're in principle, to perform certain functions. So those 4 entities, plus the 5th, the DEP, has to be able to delegate certain authority to the town. So there are 5 entities that have to interconnect along the way on the pathway to us being able to implement this alternative. And I do want to emphasize that this is optional. The developer does not have to follow this. The developer can say, I'm good with the NERPA and the Army Corps regulations as they are. My situation is such that I can live with that. I'd rather do that than this alternative. So it's optional on the part of the developer. And that's would be in this chart, if you could read it.
And so, well, Evan just basically breezed through the rest of the slideshow, so we don't really have to do it. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, just to summarize again, the benefits of the Maine Vernal Pool Special Area Management Plan. It provides certainty and predictability for applicants or developers who would come before the planning board. It's a municipal tool for encouraging compact development in the designated development area. It's an economic incentive for development where municipalities want development, again, within the designated development area. At the scientific level, it conserves vernal pools in the landscape or large-scale context within the rural area. It supports the municipal vision for rural lands, so not to push growth out into the rural area. And in some ways, it provides remuneration to rural landowners. You know, if they have a large parcel of land and there happens to be a vernal pool and they don't plan on developing it, and they place a conservation easement on their property, they could be compensated using this tool. So we're going to go through this chart that shows how this tool would work at the municipal level, and you know, when the planning board's role would fit into this. Part of this is going to be talking about the ordinance, which is why we're here tonight. And once we go through this chart, Evan's going to talk more detail about the ordinance, but we figure we'll show where the ordinance plays within this greater scheme of things first. So first, there has to be some municipal interest in the incentive and in this tool, which Orono has. With talks through with the council. Evan has told me that they are interested in pursuing this tool further. In order for a municipality to be part of the SAMP program, they have to have an adopted comprehensive plan, which the town of Orono has in 2015. And that comprehensive plan has to have current consistency finding from the Municipal Planning Assistance Program at the state, which our comprehensive plan does. And it has to include a designation of rural and growth areas, which our comprehensive plan does designate a growth area and a rural area, which is that map that you have shows that. The municipality then has to have adopted ordinance language in order to create authority for issuing NERPA permits for vernal pools. And then also collecting a fee for impacts to the vernal pools. and also a mechanism for the town to set what that fee is going to be. And we'll talk about that in more detail later, but there's options for how to set the fee that the developer would have to pay if he or she chooses to go forward with this incentive.
Just quickly, I don't want to get ahead, but is our ordinance, does that have to be reviewed and approved by all the players that you were talking about? The Army Corps and the DEP and what have you?
This is based, our ordinance is based on the model ordinance that was incorporated into the SAMP and approved. So the basic language is there, it just has to be customized in a way that takes into account the anomalies of our particular ordinance. Thompson would do the same thing, so it'd be customized, but the basics are there and already approved. They will have to look at it, but as long as it doesn't stray far from what was in the SAMP, it's good.
So in addition to the ordinance, we would need to map and have adopted the designated development area. So right now, that map that you have is a draft, and that also needs to be approved by the Army Corps of Engineers going forward. So right now, it's just in draft form along with the ordinance. And like I explained before, the designated development area is a subsection of what was identified in the comp plan as the designated growth area, and it really just takes out already conserved land that can't be developed upon. And like we've been talking about before, this is the area where it's adjacent to existing development, served by sewer and water, and walkable to services and amenities, and a lot of infill development on smaller lots. And like I said, it has to be approved by the DEP and the Army Corps of Engineers. There's the map again. Yeah, sure.
Jan's right in that some of those red areas, which are part of our designated growth area but excluded from this area that would be eligible for the vernal pool option, several of them are conservation, Piney Knoll, some of the wildlife areas in town. But there are 2 blocks that are not conserved, but they're just not served by water sewer. And their development, the prospects for near-term development are low. And part of that is from the golf course down, including the golf course, south in the so-called Gateway MDR district. And part of it is west of 95 in the economic development zone, where there is very limited frontage and other prospects that part of that land is included and part of it's not. The reason these are excluded is the agencies were looking for something smaller than our total growth area. So we needed to find what we thought could be acceptable as Janice said, subsection, sub-area of the growth area.
And one final criteria that the municipality has to go through before being able to be eligible to be part of the program is to have a signed agreement with a third-party nonprofit land conservation organization, which Evan mentioned before. We're in talks with the Orono Land Trust about being that third-party nonprofit land trust organization. And again, there's a separate document that was approved through the SAMP process that is a third-party agreement that spells out the roles and responsibilities and reporting requirements of the third-party organization and the municipality, so we know who needs to do what basically within this partnership. So once all the criteria is in place, the municipality, we can then move forward and apply to the Board of Environmental Protection, who would then give the municipality delegated authority to be able to provide a permit necessary to be able to develop on a vernal pool or within an area where there is vernal pools. So then that brings us to where the planning board would be affected. So now we have this ordinance, you know, hypothetically, if this proposed ordinance goes forward and, you know, everything's in place, an applicant would then be able to choose this alternative when going through a site plan review or through a subdivision. And so if they choose to go forward with using the main vernal pool SAMP or the vernal pool overlay district, they would have to go through, and Evan's gonna go through the ordinance for you, but they would have to fulfill certain obligations before they could take advantage of this, and one of those things is to pay a fee. And they would have options for, well, the town would set the fee, and they would have to pay that, and then that money would go to the third party, sorry, there we go, to the third party, oh, sorry, I just want to be clear that the applicant does not have to choose to go forward with this incentive, as Evan stated before. They could always choose to go with the standard regulatory ways that are vernal pools are regulated now, but also to be clear that, you know, this doesn't waive all permits. They would still need to get all other local, state, and federal permits aside from the permits that are for vernal pools. And that permit they would then get from the municipality instead of applying to either the state or the federal regulatory agency. So then the applicant would pay a fee, and that fee would be transferred to the third-party land trust organization. The third party would then use that money to undertake conservation actions, and those types of conservation actions could be through easement on land, or they could outright buy a piece of land altogether, as long as that land meets a certain requirement, and what the SAMP says is 2 pools plus 70 acres, and as I said before, the vernal pools are part of that 70 acres. For each pool that is impacted within the designated development area. And therefore, going through the conservation easement or fee simple acquisition by the land trust, that land would be protected in perpetuity, so forever. And as I said, that land would then have to meet certain criteria that is set up by the main vernal pool conservation criteria, which is both biological criteria and a landscape level criteria. So the biological criteria would be that it meets the definition of a significant vernal pool, or it has egg mass counts that meet or exceed the counts in the Fish and Wildlife database, and the significant vernal pools are based on the amount of egg counts that are within the pool. And then there also has to be some sort of landscape criteria so to ensure that this is done at a larger level than just, you know, single protection, small scale. So once the conservation goes forward, we would have to report back, the municipality would have to report back to the Army Corps of Engineers and the DEP to let them know how, you know, what's been happening, what land's been protected, monetary things have to be reported back to them, the status of our agreement with the land trust, things like that. And that's done on a yearly basis. And then the team that Evan was a part of to create the main vernal pool SAMP would meet annually to review the SAMP and ensure that it's still a working document, that it's actually working to achieve the goals that the group intended upon, and to see if there was any need to change the SAMP to work better for the group. And so with that, do you want to take questions now, or do you want to just explain first?
I'm curious to hear your ordinance description, because I'm confused on the mechanism for the land trust acquiring land, or, you know, whether it's land they own and they put easements on. I'd love to hear quite a bit more. I think that'll probably come out of your discussion in the ordinance, but.
I'll just sit right here.
Okay. You've got the ordinance, the draft ordinance in front of you, right? All of you have copies?
Yep.
I could give you sort of a real broad brush overview, or I could go through this section by section. It's something that you probably need to have at least a basic understanding of in order to be able to make your recommendation to the council.
Were board members able to review this? Just, yeah. So would you prefer section by section or broad overview?
Broad overview.
Yeah, and then if we have particular questions.
Yeah, I mean, I have a bunch of questions when I read through it, but if you read it thoroughly enough and you're comfortable with that, I guess a broad overview would probably suffice.
All right. So just some understanding of a couple of terms that are in the definitions. The definitions are, I think, for the most part, self-explanatory. But one of the definitions is permittee responsible mitigation activities. The way the SAMP is set up and the way this ordinance is set up is that there are actually two ways the developer could participate in this if they chose to participate in it. One way is to simply pay a fee to the town, which would then be transferred, as Janice said, to the Orno Land Trust, per the agreement that the town will have with the land trust. That fee will either be, must be either 40% of the delta in appraised value between what that land appraised value is with the vernal pools in place and what the value of that land would be as if the vernal pools did not exist there. And part of the research that was done is, you know, how does that actually work? There was an appraiser who was on board the committee and a consultant and did quite a lot of work at looking how that could work. But it's 40%, so that's in the SAMP, and that's a set number. So if the change in value is $50,000, then the fee would be $20,000, would come to the town for transfer to the land trust to acquire easements. The second possible way that the developer could do it, and this was really a suggestion of a developer who was on the working group, was that the developer could take the initiative in advance and essentially acquire rural land that meets all the criteria and which has been vetted to meet the criteria to be a priority vernal pool with a requisite landscape around it. Could in advance go out and acquire that and then use that as the mitigation, okay? In terms of the fee, the town has the option, in addition to setting that 40% number, to also set a minimum fee. So it could be either the 40% or the minimum fee, whichever is larger. And that's there because there may be times when the difference in fee would be rather modest. You know, $1,000, and you're not going to buy a lot of easement for $1,000. So the town has the option, if it wants, to set a minimum fee that would be meaningfully able to contribute to the acquisition of easement land. And then the developer could choose to go ahead with that, you know, the vernal pool being there or not, depending on other considerations that the developer would have. And my strong recommendation would be that the town set that minimum fee for reasons of our land market and our land market dynamics. So, are there any questions about that? That the developer has two choices to participate. If the choice to participate is by paying the fee and not having to go worry about acquiring the necessary land themselves out in the rural area, that fee will either be 40% of the difference in appraised value or some minimum fee. And if the town chooses to set that minimum fee. That minimum fee might be set at a level that would enable both a meaningful contribution to the acquisition of the easement and to make sure that the third-party conservation organization, land trusts, costs of doing that acquisition, surveying it, doing whatever assessment of the land is necessary, future stewardship, are covered. A percentage of that 40% automatically would be available for the land trust to do that, but that might not be enough, so the minimum fee could take that into additional account. So any questions about that? That's a really important part of this whole thing. Yes.
I have two.
Yes.
If the developer chooses to buy a parcel somewhere else, and it meets those criteria, how is that monitored?
According to the ordinance, they must have the agreement with the land trust, have a vetting of the land to make sure that it meets the standards.
Right.
They have to report that to the Army Corps of Engineers and document that it meets it. And there has to be an agreement with the land trust, that the land trust deems it meeting the criteria.
Does it have to be within Orono's boundaries?
That's a great question. The first priority is within Orono boundaries, but the SAMP allows it to be within an adjacent community if that adjacent community has the requisite municipal things in place, a comprehensive plan and designated growth in rural area that's been found consistent by the state. They can go to the adjacent land, or the conservation organization can go anywhere within their area of jurisdiction. So if, Orono Land Trust were active in Alton, let's just say, Alton could come into play.
That caught my attention too, when I was wondering if there was any discussion of reciprocal agreements, if we're gonna preserve vernal pools in another community. I was just trying to figure out what, obviously it benefits the environment, you're preserving a vernal pool, but there wouldn't be any benefit necessarily for the town, so.
Well, the benefit of the town is that you get a development where you want it.
Yep.
And that's really one of the driving factors behind all of this, is to be able to streamline the ability to develop where you want it, or remove some, something that sometimes is an obstacle that is very difficult to overcome in a logical and environmentally as well as fiscally responsible way.
You mentioned, and I read this when I was going through there, I had concern that, it seemed to me, and maybe I didn't read it correctly, but that there would be quite a bit of burden on the land trust to figure out what's acceptable, because you mentioned, you just had a comment in your reply to Lisa, but
yeah.
I don't know whether, and I guess my thought was, if the land trust has the expertise to understand what's acceptable parcels and what, what can be part of a negotiation. I wasn't sure, because I was on the land trust for a while, that they had staff or whether they're supposed to hire people. I was confused when I read that in the ordinance, and you just
and there'll be a
brought it up.
third-party agreement, by the way, that's separate from the ordinance, that spells out some things. But we have several things that get a leg up. First of all, as I think you all may know or recall, we did an initial townwide attempt, an attempt at a townwide survey of vernal pools. It can only by its nature be partial, but in 2008, 2009, in that period, with the help of Dr. Calhoun and her folks, the town flew, we flew the town with infrared orthophotography in order to then be able to do photo analysis of where possible vernal pools were located. And that evaluation was done by Stantec. And then when we had that in hand, Aram and her graduate student, Dawn Morgan, trained citizen scientists, including Dave and Bucky and Sue and Pat and a number of other people, to go out over 2 different years during April and May to go out and actually document what was happening in these pools. And then Dawn followed that up with an analysis, a review of that, and
just
so
the ones they had access to.
We actually,
Just the ones they had access to, or were
Yes,
granted permission.
we only could go where landowners gave us permission, which was about half the pools.
Okay.
but we also know where possible vernal pools, other possible vernal pools are. And then there's another third, that probably only gets about 2/3 of the pools, according to Aram, because ground cover and other things are gonna obscure existing pools. But in any case, we have a real good idea, and it's on this map right here, which you probably can't make out well.
It was in the
It's in your packet too, of where a number of the priority vernal pools exist already. So to some extent, it's a matter of the land trust simply talking to those landowners, because we already know that those are gonna meet the criteria. Secondly, and this was, the land trust had, you've anticipated their concern well. They had that concern, and Aram appears to be very committed, even past her retirement as in academia, if and when that happens, to simply assist the land trust in identifying pools and working with them. So
That concerned me, because I was just thinking there is turnover in the land trust.
Yes,
I was part of
yes.
that turnover, and I was wondering whether Aram would step up, but I don't know how that, I guess if you're trying to set something up over the long haul, whether that's a decent arrangement, or,
well, we probably don't have many options.
yeah.
There is no other option that we know of, and I think it's certainly well within the land trust mission. And I, as a practical matter, we're not gonna get a lot of these, I don't think.
Right.
In some ways, the best opportunities for it have gone by the board, because that would have been Orchard Trails and the Avenue, in particular, those two developments, because they had a lot of reason to have wanted to have been able to take advantage of a program like this, but it wasn't available. And they would have generated enough of a delta to be able to generate the funds necessary to go get easements. But we don't know, these things popping up every time we get a project, like the Union Street project. Yes, indeed, there was a vernal pool that was not identified from the aerial interpretation. The Cali Road Business Park, when we were doing that, 2 popped up that didn't show up in the survey. So they're there, and we don't know, that's part of the issue. They're hard to identify except in the field, or to verify except in the field. And we don't know where this tool will be really helpful. But I think it will only be few and far between that the land trust will be asked to do this, not as if they're going to be asked to do this 10 times a year.
Did you get any feedback from the developer? Because I was reading through this, and say you've got one vernal pool, you're looking at preserving 70 acres. 1 for 2
Yeah.
with 70 acres. So you got 2 in a project,
The
not that we have
developers, yeah,
too many. I was just trying to figure out whether, then you're looking at, 140 acres of
Well,
preserved land. If you had 2 vernal pools on an in-town in the developable area, not that
Yeah.
there's too many, but I was just trying to figure out how feasible 70 acres.
It's not the developer's problem, though, right? Essentially, the developer can just say, I'm gonna
Right.
pay
You
40% of
just-
delta, and now it's not my problem.
Right, and the land trust has to
Right.
figure the rest out. Yeah.
Which is, that would be one of my questions, is has anyone actually studied, how many scenarios are there actually in Orono where this is feasible?
Yeah, since
Yeah.
I've been here in the 11+ years that I've been here, I can think of
Pierce's
3
development?
and maybe 4 times it would have been used.
But meaning that 40% of the delta would have been enough for the land trust to actually go take action and purchase or preserve 70
No.
acres of land with 2 vernal pools on it.
Right.
I mean, when I look at all these variables coming together to work,
Yeah.
I'm like, we can pass this, that's fine.
Mhm.
And in 10 years, we'll be sitting here and I think the developer will take advantage of it. I think that's doable. I just don't know, and if I'm a developer and I'm saying, oh, for 40% of that delta,
Or the minimum.
or the minimum, either way, I'm like, oh, that's a pretty good deal, I'll do that. But I just don't know if that delta is
It's
gonna
going
be
to
enough.
buy an easement.
Yeah, I don't think the other side of that's ever
That's
gonna
what I
happen.
was wondering.
We had real concern about that.
Yeah,
And so the evolution of the discussion, now I give great credit to the regulators for taking a risk here from their point of view.
right, yeah.
And from their point of view, that risk was just what you said. And from my point of view, during all this discussion was, what's the liability of the municipality You know, if the delta is $7,000 and $7,000 doesn't buy what you have to buy, what's our liability if we have any? And in the end, the SAMP wiped away any liability on the part of the town and simply said, if within 3 years, the funds generated by this system aren't sufficient to buy the vernal pools and the surrounding landscape in the conservation organization's area of jurisdiction, either the town or adjacent towns or whatever, then the funds collected will all go into, I'm going to forget the name of the fund. There's, yes, Natural Resources Protection Fund, which is already a state-established mechanism. It's that where funds, mitigation funds for wetland disturbance go.
Yes, sir.
And those funds are then reallocated on a biophysical basis. And our region is a very large biophysical region. And for the protection of comparable natural resources within that big biophysical region. That probably wouldn't be, could very well not be Orono. I mean, it might be down in Orland or something. But there is that outlet so that nobody's on the hook and the money that's generated is in fact going to a good thing. And the regulators were satisfied with that, and now that is part of the SAMP.
So it's an experiment. And we'll see
It's
how
an
it goes.
experiment, it's a pilot, and that's partly why this working group will get together annually
Yeah.
and figure out, is it working, what are the obstacles, how can you, we're pretty sure it's not perfect at this point. All we know is it got to a very friendly consensus, and Dave and Pat were there, I think, at every meeting, along with Jeff Gordon and myself. And as I said, Shep was at several of them. You know, it came together very amicably, you know, based on as many facts and analyses as everybody had available to them.
Well, given the attention on our comp plan about preserving rural areas, it'd be nice to see if it could work, so that the incentive is useful, so.
Yeah, and I think there are other possibilities that aren't part of this, or, I mean, it's not part of the ordinance, and it's not necessarily, there are other strategies that the town could take if it wanted to, or the Orono Economic Development Corporation, which Shep chairs, could take if they want to. I don't want to, I mean, it's not necessary to discuss those, but I think there are other strategies to try to make sure that some of the Orono rural lands with these vernal pool ecosystems really are targeted and make way for development where we want the development to occur.
Yeah, I just make a comment. I think this whole process has, with the people from the town that were involved in it, to be able to interact with the Corps of Engineers, the DEP, and some of the other people and establish relationships that in the future could be very, very advantageous to us. In fact, I already know that as far as the Corps is concerned, we have several people we work with that we have a good relationship with now. So that's sort of a side benefit to all of this. And the example of the avenue, I mean, a good vernal pool has got almost no woodland around it now. That's going to die and be gone. We save something, it's not going to be there for very long.
I know on paper, that was always my concern, 250 feet. It met the regulations, we had to pass
Oh,
it.
it's 250 feet, but it only has to be a percentage of that saved. You don't have to have the whole 200 feet all the way around it.
Yeah.
It's only part of it.
Yeah, and NERPA, as Jana pointed out, only addresses significant vernal pools. And what the biologist said all along was, you know, this was an important piece of the Natural Resource Protection Act from our biological point of view, but it was a political act. 250 feet is nothing to do with the way the biology works. And, you know, the potential for isolation of these pools is pretty substantial. So that was their incentive to try to move to something else. And to their credit, they recognized that the Growth Management Act of Maine and the comprehensive plans such as Orono have these designated growth areas, but only be told that, sorry, you can't develop there because now you got this. And what this will do is it's not tied to that significant, solely to that evaluation of significance. There are some vernal pools, I think the avenue had 4 vernal pools that were identified, only one of which was NERPA significant, right? I think.
Yeah, I think that's right.
But that doesn't, but what happens is that it might not have the egg masses this year, and under the NERPA, if you survey it in the year that it doesn't have the egg masses, it is not significant forever.
Yeah.
But even though next year it might. So that, the biologists saw that as, you know, a necessary political compromise to get vernal pools onto the table, into the NERPA as significant wildlife habitat, but they never have had confidence that it would actually preserve those ecosystems under most circumstances where there's development around it. Okay, so we've talked about the fees and the different mechanisms available to the developer to accept this option. The district itself, geographically, is what Jana pointed out. It's a large subset of our designated growth area. Importantly, and I think this is a deficiency of the SAMP, which I hope in a year we can revisit, or next time the working group gets together and revisits, and that is, under the comprehensive planning laws of Maine, which we followed very carefully, you have to have a growth and rural area map, which designates growth area, designates large rural area, but also allows the designation of a transitional area. A transitional area is an area where growth is generally acceptable and, you know, it's not a bad thing, but it doesn't have the utilities and things to develop in any particular intense way. So you end up with, you know, 1.5 acre, 2 acre, 3 acre subdivisions. Our transitional area is that area around Maxfield Drive and Crestview Drive and Forest Hollow subdivision. It's basically from Stillwater Ave out to about Taylor Road. And in the map, it shows up as orange. The SAMP does not recognize that as either being an area that you can develop as part of the designated development area, nor as the rural area in which you can preserve things at a landscape level. The working assumption in the SAMP was that, well, that can be developed as 2 and 3 acre lots, so it's, you know, not really going to be available for landscape level preservation. In fact, I think it can be, and I hope we can change that, you know, as time goes on, because I think there are some important vernal pools in that area of town, and, you know, landowners may be willing and interested in selling an easement on them. So, but that's an important consideration. Can we get to that map, just to make sure? So you can see the orange area there. That's in comprehensive plan terms, it's the low density residential district, but in comprehensive plan terms, it's the transitional growth area.
I was trying to estimate from the previous slide how many vernal pools were in the orange. There was a handful.
Yeah, there is a handful.
There's a couple that looks like they don't meet criteria.
Yeah, it's hard to see, but there are a handful, but there are always going to be more. Whenever you actually look at a landscape and have a hydrologist, a wetland biologist go out there, they always find one that you don't see here. Okay. There's a fair amount in the ordinance as required by the SAMP that lays out the procedure to make sure the money is being collected properly, transferred properly, and used properly, and reported properly. That's what a lot of this, the section on paragraph E1, vernal pool mitigation fee, which runs for a few pages. That's what that is all about.
Just before we move ahead, on page 3, you had mentioned delegated authority was part of the process that goes through, but there's a line up at the top of page 3 that says granted partial delegated authority, and I wondered what partial delegated authority.
Under current Maine law, any municipality with the requisite planning board and other capabilities can apply to the DEP for full delegated authority under NERPA, which means that any significant wildlife habitat, wetlands, wading, bird habitat, and so forth, the municipality could take over the permitting authority for that from DEP. Most towns don't want to do that because that's a huge burden.
Yep.
that requires a lot of expertise and so forth, so very few towns do that. This would be partial delegated authority, meaning just vernal pools.
Yep.
And as Jana pointed out, and this is really important, it's important for every developer to understand too, that if a vernal pool is embedded in a wetland, and they're going to alter the wetland as well as the vernal pool, they still have to go to the state and federal authorities to get the permits for the wetland part of it.
Yep.
It's just that they don't have to worry about that big radius of protection around the vernal pool. It's much easier to get approvals to alter a small area of wetland than it is anything to do with the vernal pool.
So, back to the fees, the 40%, that was part of the template?
Yes,
That
that's
was
in the
agreed,
SAMP.
and then the town can just do the minimum.
Can set a minimum, and so.
Right, set a
so
minimum.
I
I
would
just-
certainly recommend that if this is adopted and it comes time to adopt those fees, which would
Yep.
be part of the fee schedule that the council adopts, I'd recommend that it be the greater of the delta or the minimum.
I was just wondering where the mitigation fee, but you said that was part of the SAMP template, so somebody else discussed that.
That's right,
So that's not, yeah,
that's not
the town.
negotiable. That's
Yep.
something that was
Okay.
worked out between the biologists, the developers, the municipal
Yep.
folks
Good.
talking, and the appraisers. Now, we have other parts of our ordinance that are gonna be impacted by this change. You create this district and you have these things about vernal pools. How does that affect our performance standards for wildlife, for example? How does it affect our cluster development with the open space requirements and so forth? So we have to pay attention to the reverberations of this through the ordinance, and we've tried to do that. Sometimes we don't do that 100% successfully, and Janet's gonna have to come back to you and say, you know, Evan screwed up. She's got the authority to do that. So in cluster development, as you know, the whole thesis of cluster development is that developer gets a significant bonus in terms of density, how many dwelling units they can build on a given area of land, in return for preserving open space. And that open space has to be a certain percentage of the total land area and must include all fragile natural resources, wetlands, steep slopes, ledge outcrops, wildlife habitat, that's significant wildlife habitat, including vernal pools and wetland, you know, that sort of thing. So the question is, so now a developer comes in and says, I'm gonna do the cluster development, but I'm also gonna take advantage of this vernal, what do you do? Do they have to preserve that or don't they have to preserve it? And how does it count in terms of calculation of density and all that stuff? Well, this proposal addresses that and basically says that the vernal pool only has to be, if you choose that overlay district option, you only have to preserve the vernal pool if it is embedded within or adjacent to another natural resource that must, under the cluster ordinance, be preserved as open space. If it happens to be a freestanding depression that's not part of a wetland complex or wild, identified, recognized wild, deer wintered habitat or something like that, that's otherwise in that category, you would not have to preserve that. I think in most cases, these things are part of some larger complex, so they might be, they'd have to set that aside as open space anyways under our cluster ordinance. This just makes that clear, what, when they do and when they don't have to. And I think all the changes there in that section 18-136, paragraphs D and G, that's what it says. There's a little bit of housekeeping, changing, moving some sentences around, but that's the only thing it does. Any questions on that? Okay. And by the way, this follows legislative protocols where new is underlined. Mm-hmm. Existing but deleted is struck through, and anything that's not underlined or struck through is what the current ordinance says. And we're not changing it. Then we have a performance standard section in our ordinance. Section 18-144 that deals with wildlife and natural areas preservation. And generally what this section says, that any project that affects significant wildlife or fisheries habitat as identified by the comprehensive plan or by a state or federal agency needs to have some mitigation measures to minimize the impact. You try to avoid it or you mitigate it in some way. And we look at that standard every time you get a site plan or subdivision application in. What we've done here is added a paragraph B to that section on vernal pools. Again, there's a little bit of housekeeping elsewhere, but it doesn't do anything, doesn't change anything.
I was curious on that too, because there's the whole numbered list there, and I was just thinking about other references to state regulations. So that whole list is, right out of the state. So I'm just curious if NERPA regulations ever change, whether you would just have a general reference, like the most current vernal pool standards or something like that. Because you list them all out namely, but the state changes things up.
That's a good question. We can say as may be amended in the future.
Yeah, because they do change things periodically, but for what it's worth.
Thank you for that. So the vernal pools, I want to point this out because there is one small but I think important difference. I guess in a way we've written this standard where we've added vernal pools, a specific thing on vernal pools to this wildlife management performance standard. We've added an approach that tries to create some incentive for the developer to move towards this alternative form, if it makes sense to them to do so. And that is that we are saying that if the development is located within the overlay district, the vernal pools overlay district, and there are one or more vernal pools identified on the site, they need, if they're not going to use the vernal pools overlay option, then they have to demonstrate that they are minimizing disturbance to that vernal pool, whether it is significant under NERPA or not. And that's the difference. Right now, today, if they came in and there was a vernal pool identified on the site, if it was not significant, then, except to the extent that it was a part of a bigger wetland, they wouldn't have to worry about it under our standards. Here, they would have to recognize it as a natural resource that is wildlife habitat, unless they move ahead with the alternative option. That's a twist that's peculiar to our ordinance, because it's just the way our current ordinance is written. Our current ordinance says it has to be a resource recognized by the comprehensive plan or federal or state agency. And that's a gray area because the federal and state governments treat it differently. So I've suggested in this draft that we just recognize any vernal pool as important.
Is this, I'm trying to recall, has this gone before council committee?
Yeah,
Comes to us?
initial discussion, but I don't, yes.
Right, I was just wondering whether that was raised any eyebrows. I would hope it wouldn't, I don't mind it, but.
It didn't in first round, but, this is not all that easy to digest.
Yep.
It's a big thing, which is why we're having this discussion with you. But it's a matter that you should be aware of, and if you disagree with it or think that should be modified, you should have that opportunity to do so.
So can I just clarify, because you gave me permission by saying this was a lot to digest? So that's part of the SAMP then, that if there's any vernal pool, that they have to follow this?
Yeah, under the SAMP, you are relieved of the normal federal and state regulations, which are as follows. And this is a little bit, took me a while to figure it out and to understand it, over the years, but they're different. So under state regulation, the only vernal pools that are regulated as vernal pools are significant.
Yeah, right, so that has to do with egg mass.
They have to do egg mass counts or the presence of a particular species, the fairy shrimp, which is a threatened species. So if it's any of those things, if it's that, it's regulated. If it's part of a wetland complex and the wetland is being altered, then any wetland is also significant wildlife habitat and is regulated. Under federal regulation, the Army Corps of Engineers only has jurisdiction if you are altering a wetland. If you have a vernal pool embedded within a wetland, but you are not altering that wetland itself, you can develop right up to its edge, but you're not touching the wetland, you do not need an Army Corps permit. If you have, conversely, if you have a wetland over here and a standalone vernal pool over here, and that wetland is being altered, they will regulate that vernal pool too. The Avenue is a classic case where you had 4 vernal pools, all of them embedded in wetlands. They bent over backwards and touched their toes 17 times to not touch the wetland. And they did that through mechanisms that they had to come back and change. You all will remember that they were provided a very sophisticated stormwater management plan using porous pavement, because the only way they could do a storm detention pond was to disturb a wetland that was going to cause them to have to go to the Army Corps. They didn't want to go to the Army Corps under any circumstance. So it's 2 different systems. One where the criteria is significant vernal pool, the other is simply, are you disturbing a wetland and there's a vernal pool somewhere on the property. So what we're saying here is that if you are going to be developing a site and there's a vernal pool of any kind, is a verified vernal pool, significant or not, you have to take that into account and discuss how you're going to protect it or mitigate it or minimize damage to it.
Okay.
That goes beyond what our current standard is, where it basically has to be significant. And so that's a change. But it's also a way to encourage developers to move towards this alternative format if they think it makes sense for them to do so. Okay. And then the remaining amendments simply catch up to these other changes so that some of it just is a little bit of house cleaning, because there are deficiencies in our ordinance.
No.
That will be cleaned up. I mean, they're problematic when you run into them. You don't run into them every day, so they're kind of under the radar. But when you come across, and you're doing something, and you come across and say, oh, and so there's a couple little weaknesses in section 18-166 classification projects in terms of what you have to submit for minor developments in site plan review. And I just wanted to put in some language to make sure that information about vernal pools had to be included, okay? Under other language, general language, it's general language to make sure that happens. I put that as just housekeeping, not a policy change. Under site plan review application, again, submission requirements, identifying vernal pools is something you have to identify whether they're significant or not. There's site plan review criteria, paragraph M, natural features, which has to align with the general wildlife preservation standard elsewhere in the ordinance. and allows them cross references to the overlay district alternative. And then this item in 8, under subdivision 8 and 9, these are just the submission, the contents of what has to be submitted as part of a preliminary plan and a final plan, and makes clear that you have to submit the information about vernal pools. Usually that's done anyways, but we're just clarifying that you have to do it whether it's a significant pool or not a significant pool. So just trying to make sure we're not running into creating some internal inconsistencies in the ordinance. But the broad brush, I think you get, and the other detail you can digest as
Thank you.
you need to. Okay.
So this is a public hearing. And we've had 3 troopers that have stayed awake through the whole thing. So while I have you here, I'm going to open up the public hearing, and then we're just going to continue this until our next meeting. But feel free to, you've lasted this long, step up to the mic. Please tell us who you are and your comments.
Bucky Owen, past president of the Orno Land Trust. I think you hit on 3 of the issues that we have been most concerned about. We've been working with Evan and Aram for, well over a year at this point. One is, are there available vernal pools in the rural district that we could look at? And I think the question is absolutely yes. We know of some already. There are some on the maps. I know of 2 on landowners who didn't allow us to do surveys, that under this, back areas on lots that might be developed on the front, they might very well look at a conservation easement as an option that's good for them. So I think we can explore that. So I'm not concerned about finding areas that could be used for mitigation. Aram has guaranteed us until she flops over that she will work with us and help us in identifying this and monitoring them and all of that kind of business. At the same time, we're kind of unique here because we have access to a lot of people at the university who have expertise. And the land trust already, I think, compared to most land trusts in the state, has a lot of scientific people who have science backgrounds who can work in this area. A number of us are getting a little aged and probably won't be around too much longer, but we can recruit people from the university to help us to do this. And so I'm not too concerned about that. I am concerned about the dollars available to carry out the project, and several of you have indicated that. The 40%, if you're going to buy an easement on 70 acres, or if there's 2, you're talking about conceivably as much as 140 acres if they're totally separate. That's a lot of money. And easements, we'd have to go and get some values. Before I think the town would consider a minimum amount, we'd want to do some investigation on what easements are costing, so we could get that. The second aspect of that is the land trust is taking on a long-term obligation because we have to monitor and report sort of ad infinitum on these rascals. And we are we're one of 20% of the land trusts in Maine are totally volunteer, and we are one of those. So we would have to set up a framework within the land trust, which we've talked about, and I think we could do, to do the reporting and ensure that the kind of information flows to the town and to the state agencies or the federal agencies. So we've talked about it a lot. We've brought it to our board twice. They're willing to seriously consider this and act as a third party, but the dollar values, and it's conceivable we might have to hire somebody to do some of this monitoring on a short-term basis and so forth, and that could be students or whatever. But there is an ongoing cost to us that goes beyond just purchasing these and taking care of them.
Has there been any discussion with the town? Because again, it's quite a burden on the land trust. Would the town help support either report preparation, just to work together as a group, or the staffing? I seeing the land trust at work here with an all-volunteer board to add yet another task on top of what they already do.
I'll just note that your new town planner has some experience in this area, so she might want to respond.
I believe that within the SAMP, there is 10% allocated to the land trust for, it's not just the 40, so there is the 40% that would go for actually conservation, the conservation easement, and, or fee simple purchasing, but for appraisal and stewardship and things of that nature that are outside of, you know, of what the actual purchase or the conservation easement, there is 10% that's allocated to the land trust in the SAMP, I believe, Evan?
That's right, 6%, 4%.
Yeah, 6% allocated toward some sort of tasks and 4% to another, and combined 10%, and that has to do with stewardship and hiring of an appraiser if necessary, and any
Is that,
outside costs.
but isn't that included in that 40%? I think it is too. That was our concern, was that, you know, if you're gonna hire a surveyor and all of that business and appraisals, that gets pretty expensive.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's where we wanted to see that the town minimum would be able, so that we'd be able to fund, we don't wanna make any money on this, but we certainly don't wanna go into debt too. So, we'd wanna look at those costs and determine sort of a minimum, because I think the 40% could be low, under certain conditions.
Right, so I would assume that the ongoing discussions, there would be coordination with the town to make sure if they're gonna take on that burden, that the land trust is protected.
Yes, so when we talk to council, we would have to bring up, setting that fee and consult with the land trust.
Yep.
We could do some hypothetical situations of land in the rural area, and come up with a feasible minimum.
Mm-hmm.
Well, because I think we all want this to be successful and not put too much of a burden on folks that are willing to help.
If you put too
Yeah.
much of a burden on the land trust, because then,
Right.
and it doesn't work if you put too much burden on the developer, and it doesn't work if you put too much burden on the town. These players have to work together, so
Right.
of course we want to be able to have the third party part of the team.
Mhm.
So we'll come up, we'll try to figure out that minimum fee so that it works for the land trust.
We're also working on a model easement at the same time that would go along with this. So we're kind of working through both areas.
And the third party agreement as
Right,
well.
those two.
Outlines, you know, what the municipality is responsible for and what the land trust is responsible for.
So deviations, when I asked about that, and what the reviewing agencies have to look for, these aren't significant deviations from the model template?
Well, so-
Your hunch is that what we're talking about is okay, that, yeah.
Yeah, the part that was not okay was a suggestion to deviate from the 40%,
Right.
unfortunately. So we are able to come up with a minimum fee, instead of messing with that 40%, we can then come up with a minimum fee. So, but, yeah, the conservation easement is a model that was, approved by the SAMP, and the third party agreement was a model that was approved by the SAMP, and even this ordinance is a model approved by the
Yep.
SAMP. So we are within the means of the SAMP.
Good.
Is the minimum fee per deal essentially? I mean, is that something that you can set depending on the situation, or is it a standard minimum fee?
It would be a standard minimum fee that's set,
Okay. And then the other question I have is that, is there any tax incentive for the developer to do this, i.e. it's kind of a conservation thing that they're giving money to?
there wouldn't be a tax incentive for the developer. There would be a tax incentive for the rural landowner who would put their land in an easement or restrict it to being conserved without development forever. So they would essentially put their land into open space, and they would have a tax deduction because of that.
I think these lands could be in tree growth too. In other words, it's not
Any other comments? Okay, step right up.
Hi, I'm Lori Osher. I'm an Orno resident, and I would like to see more housing closer to town, which is part of what the comprehensive plan also says. And so I was interested in hearing how these would affect encouraging a developer to come back and try to do development where Black Bear Heights had been proposed. So I'm new to sitting through this meeting, and there was a lot of information. So I'm wondering if it would be possible for the people who are in the know to sort of use that as an example.
Well, based on the development that was proposed and cut back, I don't know what a future proposal would look like, but just looking back at that 2004 proposal, if this had been in place then, the developer could have gone ahead and proposed to develop 26 additional lots. Now that's the kind of development that would make this thing work well. So it would have been a 52 lot subdivision, that's right.
Had to find 140 acres somewhere else, or just 70?
There's one vernal pool, so it would have been 2 vernal pool. In the rule, the mitigation would be 2 vernal pools and a landscape level that's approximately, it says approximately, so I mean, it depends on configuration and other things, but approximately 70 acres or 30 to 40 acres per pool. That meets the landscape requirements.
So 70.
So,
Yeah.
I apologize. We try to get everything on the record, so I don't mind an occasional comment, but if we're going to have discussion, you're up at the mic.
So that would have, so you can imagine, I mean, I don't know what the appraised value of the land is at 26 lots versus 52 lots. Likely, it's roughly double. And, I know, just let's say that land was going to be, worth, in its current configuration, $200,000. I mean, I can't remember what the arrangement was, or not sure I was even privy to it. It's before my time here, and now it became $400,000. That's a $200,000 delta, or $80,000. With $80,000, my guess is you could get a good conservation easement. But that's the kind of scale we probably have to be thinking about. And it may be that there was a series of small projects that affects some vernal pools, and no one will be enough, even with minimum fee, to maybe be enough to well, it may have to go, to this natural resources protection.
Shadbush Lane was another.
Shadbush Lane,
that was 11 lots?
They lost, I think, 2 lots.
Okay, I was thinking it was more, but either way.
2 lots they had to combine 1 lot into 1 large lot, which is permanently conserved per the Corps. That's got a vernal pool. Yeah, that would be another example that delta would not have been as great. It would have been a modest delta, but maybe not insignificant, given what those lots are selling, where I think we're hoping to be marketed for. So.
Thank you.
Black Bear Heights really is kind of a key example, along with some of the multifamily development, that those are the kind of projects, or certain commercial projects are high-value projects that would make a difference.
I just wanted to point one thing out on page 3 of the proposed ordinance, under vernal pool mitigation fee B. It talks about the programmatic level of 2 pools plus 70 acres of terrestrial amphibian post-breeding habitat for each impacted pool. And then it defines sort of what that phrase programmatic level means. So there is some flexibility in that 70 acres. It doesn't, it's not a hard 70 acres. It's designed so that it's guidance that there's actually sufficient acreage per case by case for that pool. So if it's about 66 acres, let's say, of forested upland habitat that supports that pool, then that's sufficient. So they're not, it's not a hard 70. It's to make sure that these pools are conserved at a landscape scale, and that's the goal. So 70 acres, you know, it could be a 50 acre to support this pool is basically what is trying to say.
When I looked at that programmatic level, I was still trying to figure out what the burden of the land trust is, that third-party conservation, if they were responsible for figuring out
What the programmatic level is.
Yeah, what that level was, and I was trying to figure out, well, I wasn't aware that anybody on the land trust had that expertise to figure out what that magic number was if it deviated from 70.
Right, and I believe that that's where Aram would come in helpful.
Yep.
In this situation, in terms of figuring out what that programmatic level certainly is.
Mm-hmm. So as long as she's signed up for the rest of her days.
Or other wetland biologists, let's say, Aram and or.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's important.
Other comments? So I guess we're gonna, this was informational. Any more comments from the board? We're gonna leave the public hearing open, correct? And then I just had a habit. I looked in my,
Yes,
sorry, Evan. Yeah, so we're leaving the public hearing open.
The public hearing will be open. We'll follow this up back in December. It will be on the planning board agenda for December. And at that meeting, we could make a recommendation to council, or, you know, if there's any other, you could provide us with comments and we could go back and amend the ordinance. It's really.
Yep. So other questions from the board? I mean, I'd like you to take another look at this before our next meeting, because this was a lot to digest, as we've heard. So just review that. If you have any remaining questions, we can, well, if you have anything now, speak or hold your peace for the rest of the evening. Otherwise, we'll come back next time. All right?
Oh,
Very good.
can I ask two
Yes.
questions? Sorry, two questions before we adjourn. The first is, for the next meeting, for this meeting, we didn't do any public notification.
All right.
It was very broad. We put it in the paper, you know, put it on Facebook and posted the agenda places, but we're curious as to what the board would like to do in terms of public notification. We do have a list of the landowners who had, and I'm gonna ask Evan just to butt in if necessary, because I wasn't part of this process, but the list of the landowners who had potential vernal pools on their property, who were contacted as part of that vernal pool mapping throughout town, in the rural and the designated growth area. So we do have the ability to reach out to those people if whatever, I don't, we're looking for suggestions really from the board as to how you think we should pursue with public notice.
I think we need to make sure people are engaged in this process. This is somewhat novel. If you obscure it from them or they don't feel like they've been properly notified, we're going to hear about it. So,
Well, there's a negative outcome, right? So there is,
yeah.
now there's one negative outcome for a landowner, which is you have a non-significant vernal pool.
Yes.
Now, that's gonna fall under this, you know, before you could bury it.
Yeah.
And you can't bury it anymore. So I would say that they should be notified, because if I have a vernal pool, but it's not significant, I've kind of thought, oh, it's a hole in the ground, I can bury it. And now you're not gonna be able to bury it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
So in terms of notification, we, she mentioned the process before, you have a database for all the dots, is that correct? I just want to understand who you reached out to before.
Yes, we sent a letter to all the landowners where there were dots, where there was potential vernal pools. We didn't know if they were actually vernal pools, but that's what Stantec identified as possible vernal pools. And we sought permission from them to have the citizen scientists go onto the land to do the field work. So we had that. We got permission from about half the landowners for about half the pools. So, yes, we could, I think we still have those lists now. Those lists are, that was back, they're probably 8 years old now.
Mm-hmm. Gotta
How
start
current
somewhere.
they are,
Yeah.
yeah, but we certainly would have the map and lot numbers, so we could
I can update
update.
Yeah.
Okay, thoughts on that? So that would be the basis of the list that we'd send notice out to? You know,
Isn't it gonna be in the paper for all citizens of the town?
Yes.
It's gonna notify all the citizens.
hearing.
Yeah.
All of our standard notification procedures would still happen. This would just be specifically targeted toward a certain group of people who we hope to be here.
Penobscot Times just had that nice little article in there. The public notice is fine, but just usually a little description or just something in there. Not that everybody reads the Penobscot Times, but certain segment of the town does, so.
So
Just-
a
just
public
explaining-
notice and a.
Yeah, just a summary of, you know, what we're talking about, so
press
you
release.
don't have to
Small press
say that
release.
you're burying vernal pools, but, you know, it's just maybe some other language, but,
So like a press release
Yeah,
in
some-
addition to our.
You don't like my language?
well, it's to the point. You know,
Factual
but-
can be
yeah, it's
disturbing at times, yes.
Evan, is the other option, you know, notifying everyone in the designated development area and everyone in the rural area?
Does it really impact them though, if they don't have a vernal, well, those are the identified ones from 8 years
It's
ago,
not
but,
gonna
Yeah.
have that direct effect on most property owners, because
Right.
most property owners live on a quarter or half acre of land with a house on it, you know, and that's what it is. They might be affected by the development that goes in, you know, behind them on the big tract of land behind them or something like that. But I think,
Yep.
notifying everybody that we know of might have a vernal pool.
does that seem sufficient? The board, are you okay with that? Yeah. All right,
And then I think the
Along with
idea of
a
a press
general notice, like in the Penobscot Times
right.
and so forth.
And then all the other, the Facebook, all the
Yeah.
other options we have, just get it out there and
Sure.
we'll try to do the best we can. So,
The second thing is, the next meeting is December 20th. And it's close to the holiday, so I don't know if that would affect anyone, if we would want to move it to the 13th, or if everyone's okay with the 20th.
Or the 27th.
The 27th wouldn't be good.
not the 27th.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? I don't mind the 13th, but
Is that the second Wednesday in the month?
It is.
it
yes.
is.
I will be here. It's the same night as the Owner Land Trust board meeting, so I can't come.
Well, that would not be a good thing to do.
Well, I don't have to be
We
here.
want them to be here.
Vacation.
Yeah, that's a
So,
good point. Land trust is involved, so
The 20th, then we'll stay with the 20th. Okay.
yep. Go with that unless any other comments. All right, we're sticking with it.
Santa Claus doesn't come for another 5 days.
Yeah, I know. We're good. All right, public hearing's open. Next item on the agenda is old business. There is none. Next item is discussion. Anybody want to discuss anything? No. All right, last item is adjournment. Can I have a
So
motion?
move.
Second.
Very good. Any further discussion on that one? No. All those in favor? See you in December.
Always get a quick second on that one.